So did Marvel basically just try to pull a John Wick 3? Hello interwebs and welcome to my review of Falcon and the Winter Soldier Episode 3, Power Broker, bum bum bum! I actually don't know if that's warranted because I don't know much about the Power Broker because I'm not a huge Marvel fangirl, but he sure seemed damn important in this episode, so I'm hoping that's all warranted. But anyways, let's get into my spoiler-free thoughts up front before we get into spoilers. So spoiler-free, what did I think of the episode? Well, like I kind of alluded to in my opening gag of this video, I actually think this episode really took a lot of cues from John Wick in all the best ways. This episode had a lot of the style from the John Wick movies. It had a lot of those like neon colored lightings. It was very vibrant in its cinematography. The tone as well felt more grounded and darker, yet could erupt into sort of these like big moments of elaborate violence that you don't often see in this sort of way with Marvel. It was very choreographed and very stylistic in a lot of the action sequence in this episode. Again, pulling right from John Wick. It also had this sort of interesting building out of the mythology of the world in that sort of John Wickian way. I think that it really was trying to draw from those types of movies in, like I said, all of the best ways, and I was heavily here for it. I just so enjoyed it. Also, what I really loved about this is this episode really felt like a more grounded, darker tone for the Marvel series. There wasn't a ton of the Marvel quips and back and forth and banter that you get in a ton of the Marvel movies, but you still felt that these characters felt true to the tone of the characters that we had seen in the much more optimistic, upbeat versions of them that we saw in other movies, which I found to be a really fascinating balance. Like, there were moments of levity and joking that felt true to characters throughout this episode. I think there's a specific scene in one part of the episode where Sam has to like drink a drink while in character that he doesn't really like. That was very funny, and yet it never broke that sort of more grounded, realistic tone. So it felt like something that if it had been done in any of the other Marvel movies would have been a much more heightened, over-the-top gag, and sort of the bickering between Sam and Bucky could have also fit in that throughout this episode, but it never sort of broke out of that tone, which I think is just true master work by the director of this episode to really make this feel cohesive with the rest of the MCU, but also still fit within this new style and tone that they were going for throughout this episode. So props to them on all those fronts. This episode also marked the proper return of Daniel Bruhl as Baron Zemo, and I have to say, he was truly fantastic. I just watched the movie Rush about 2 weeks ago, which also stars Daniel Bruhl and Thor himself, of all people, and he is so fantastic in this movie, and sort of looking at him here, I'm just like, why is this man not more known? He is a fan-freaking-tastic actor, and he just does such a great, subtle job of being menacing, and yet also very personable as the character of Zemo. As I mentioned before earlier, and also as we saw in the movie Civil War, Zemo is a character, at least in the MCU, who is honestly very relatable and understandable despite his villainy. You know, he has a very sympathetic backstory with his family, and I actually don't disagree with him in a lot of his stances. Yet he clearly is meant to be a villain, and I just love that sort of nuance that both his character and the show in general are just seeming willing to engage in on the most part. And Daniel Bruhl just brings his all to the piece. I was truly here for every scene that he was in. But this kind of brings me to my last spoiler-free thought that I have to put in here. As much as I loved overall this episode, there were a couple, what I'll kind of say is narrative cheats and easy shortcuts done throughout the episode to sort of get to different places that I ultimately kind of found a little bit frustrating as I went through. It didn't bring down the whole episode for me, but there was just a few moments where I was like, oh, that was dealt with kind of quickly. Oh, that's a little bit convenient. Oh, that doesn't entirely make sense to me. That I just kind of was like, oh, I love this episode so much, and it's just kind of disappointing that there's just these little quibbles that I'm having here and there throughout the episode. But on the whole, I think this was a really fun episode, a really stylistic gambit for Marvel that I'm just really glad that they're taking those chances with this TV show. This still feels like a big budget Marvel thing, and yet they're able to take a little bit more risk with it because it is the television show and not the movies. I don't know why I said the television show. It's the television show. We're watching the TV here. I don't know why I said it that way. But anyways, yeah, I'm just liking the risk they're taking with tone and style throughout these series, and so props to them for this because this was absolutely fantastic on the whole. But all that having been said, let's get into spoilers. For the spoiler section, as usual, I'll just kind of go step by step through some of the scenes and mention some of the things that sort of popped out to me as I thought about them. Right up front, we get this interesting commercial for the Global Repatriation Commission, which is what, I guess, Walker, the new Captain America, works for, and not necessarily the U.S. government, which is interesting that he is Captain America working for a global initiative. And I liked the juxtaposition of the two scenes that we got. They've got this commercial that sort of says, we're here to help you, and then immediately juxtaposing that with Walker, who just sort of goes in and honestly, like, strong arms these guys. He's sort of like like doing whatever he wants in this sort of Munich cityscape. And you clearly get a hint that he might be going too far. He doesn't beat up the guy that they're interrogating, but he comes close to hitting him. And it very felt out of character for a person who Captain America should be, which goes to some of the things they talk about later on in the episode. One thing I will note about the interesting part of the GCR, while I think it's interesting that there's this global commission that has sort of been set up after the blip to help people repatriate, and that's sort of probably being set up to be the bad guys of the series in the end. I wouldn't be too surprised if they're not doing terrible stuff in the end, especially since Walker himself is going to be kind of framed as maybe taking things too far. So I'm curious to see how they're going to take the nuance of that. But it is interesting, just pointing this out, that it is not the military that Walker is working for. There's clearly it feels like one of those things where like the military helped fund a lot of this movie and a lot of the Marvel MCU. So clearly the MCU couldn't use the military as the villains in the piece, and so this is sort of like an alternate thing. Whereas I feel like it might have been a little bit more interesting if it actually had been Walker working for the U.S. military. I feel like that would have been a much more directly targeted stance. But obviously, this is the MCU, and that sort of thing is unfortunately, sadly, a little bit difficult for them when they're doing something for Disney and that level of corporation. They can't go right after the U.S. military. So a bit disappointing on that front. I think that would have been a little bit more interesting, but given the politics of big global mega corporations, that is unfortunately where they have to go. But then we go to see Baron Zemo, which was a really interesting scene between Bucky and Zemo. I loved Zemo using the old words on Bucky to see how he would react, and Bucky sort of taking a straight face, like, I'm not that person anymore. Thought that was just a really cool and tense scene. And I should say the music throughout this episode was just really creepy and tense, and I really felt this sense of like anxiety throughout the episode. Just really wonderful job to the score of this episode, which is not something I usually say for Marvel products. I don't really point out the score all that much, but here it was very noticeable and very, very good. And also I should say Zemo reading Machiavelli. Of course he's reading Machiavelli. Two on the nose there, Marvel. I love it. Then we get the scene with Bucky and Sam sort of talking things out and being like, we need to break Zemo out. We need to work with him. Sam's not really in on it, but Bucky's kind of already gotten Zemo out of prison. I thought that was sort of fun. Like, it's just hypothetical, talks him through the whole escape, and then Zemo gets there. It was sort of a nice way to have that little montage of how Zemo escapes. Thought it was kind of fun. I did think it was kind of funny that basically his plan just boiled down to cause a fight and Zemo can slip out while there's a fight. And it was like this whole elaborate thing when it was like one of the more simple prison break plans I've ever seen. It wasn't a big deal because it wasn't the focus of the episode, but I just kind of found that a little bit funny as we were watching. I'm like, so your plan is pretty simple to get him out. But then they go and work with Zemo, and he has all these tools and things that they're going to use to help go and find out who had made the super soldier serum and where it came from to sort of track down the Flagsmashers. I also love the fact that Zemo is like going through and collecting his stuff, and he finds his mask, like, oh look, it's my comic book accurate mask. I'll take this for later so I can look badass. It was just sort of like, yep, there's his comic book costume. It's just sort of lying there in the car for some reason. Then we get another really cool scene with Zemo on his jet. I love the fact that he's like, hey, I was a baron, of course I was rich. And I like the fact that apparently his butler was just sort of hanging around being like, I hope he gets out of prison one day. Then I loved the sequence between Bucky, Sam, and Zemo on the plane, where Zemo sort of is looking at Bucky's list, the people that he's wronged as the Winter Soldier. And I like the little touch that notebook was Steve's notebook, the one that we saw way back in like the Winter Soldier, where Steve was writing down like different things to see, and sort of Sam connecting with Bucky in the same way that he connected with Steve. I thought that was sort of an interesting little subtle bit, and also calling out Marvin Gaye and African American cinema. That was also a nice little touch. I haven't seen that film, so I'm sure there's some sort of overlap and some themes that are kind of consistent throughout that work and this work. I don't know. Unfortunately, I haven't seen it. But I thought that was sort of a nice little connection moment between those two characters through Steve. The other thing I really liked too was Zemo talking about like how when we have these super soldiers, we put them on pedestals and we don't see their flaws. They become these symbols. And that rings so true because Steve was a symbol of America, but obviously Steve had problems with America, with S.H.I.E.L.D. and their connection with Hydra. So even he sort of like was conflicted with the symbolism that he came to embody in many ways. Again, would have been better if he had been working for the military and you could have had that juxtaposition, but again, Marvel, I can't necessarily do that direct of a thing. But I sort of like him calling that out because I don't necessarily disagree with Zemo. Like, don't get me wrong, I love my symbols. I got my Captain America shield over there. I'm a huge Star Trek fan, which is just all about like symbolic representations of virtue and ideas and things like that. So I get that, and that's very important. But I like seeing Zemo's point of view being like, we forget the flaws of people. And I always believe that it's a thing where we should look up to these people. We should like love the symbols that they come for, but we always should temper that with our understanding of their flaws and that the fact that they are actual people. And I like that seems to be the ultimate consensus that this show is going for by showing Zemo's side of being like, yeah, we need to understand the flaws. We need to break this down. We can't have super soldiers at all. That's an understandable take. But then the other side of it is just be a complete cynic and not believe in anything. So I'm liking that sort of balance between the two that the show is kind of showing us. And I think that that's being seeded really nicely in Zemo, and how right now both Bucky and Sam seem to be more aligned with Zemo ideologically, as they talk about later on in the episode. Just to bring that up here, Bucky and Sam talk about how they want to burn the Captain America shield, or at least Sam does, and that he should have just given it up because he doesn't really believe that anyone's worthy of it after Steve. And that goes to the same idea, and that sort of goes to the same idea that Zemo is having. So I like that Bucky and Sam ultimately kind of are siding with Zemo ideologically here, even if they don't necessarily agree with his tactics. So I think that that's sort of an interesting development arc for those characters going forward. Then we start to get some development for the Flagsmashers and Cali. I'll just go through their whole story arc here, and this gets to one of my big problems with the episode. We learn that Cali, the leader of the Flagsmashers, she has a sort of a relative that died in the camps because of mistreatment, wasn't treated well, and we know that we end up learning that she's fighting for the fact that she's been displaced, and a lot of the people that she loves and cares about have been displaced after the blip. Ultimately, very admirable goals, and goals that I think are actually very understandable. I love the morally grayness of the Flagsmashers here. And then they go and break open a GCR facility to go and get supplies for the relocation camps and everything like that, which makes perfect sense. Again, an understandable goal that they want supplies just to feed people when people are just sitting on things. Again, this redistribution of wealth sort of thing that I think is honestly very understandable, and something I may not agree with the tactics, but I actually agree with their ideology and their need to do these things, if not necessarily the things that they have to do in order to do it, but I understand that. That being said, this does get me to one of my niggling problems, in that Cali at the end of the episode blows up the base, killing a lot of, I won't necessarily say innocent because they are soldiers and things like that, but because they aren't necessarily civilians, but blowing up people who didn't need to be killed. And it kind of is that rubbed me a little bit the wrong way, because it kind of is framing the Flagsmashers as like, oh, look, they are definitely the bad guys. I'm like, oh, you had a much more nuanced thing going here, and I liked the idea that we were chasing after the Flagsmashers, and they weren't necessarily even all that bad. They were just sort of taking what they needed and left people alive. So Kelly's sort of blowing up the base. I get that there's this thing of like, this is the only language that people understand. That is not necessarily an incorrect representation of sometimes how these groups operate, that they take things too far, but it didn't read as necessarily believable or understandable, and just sort of was there to over highlight the villainy of these characters, when I thought her not doing that would have been a much more interesting take on this dynamic for them. It just felt like they were being framed as overly villainous, which is ultimately kind of disappointing, because I think that whether taking that character, Callie's character, that she's going to be framed as she's the bad one, and then her friend who we see there might be seen as the good one because he doesn't want to do those things. I'm kind of disappointed in that, because that like loses a little bit of the nuance that you had going on here. And if we had maybe more time to develop the Flagsmashers and their dynamic as a group, maybe I would say that we could do that. But I think because we have so many disparate factions going on here, I think that little piece of it's going to get lost in the shuffle, and so therefore I would really just rather the Flagsmashers as a whole be representative of a more nuanced take, rather than sort of like trying to show nuance within their group that we're ultimately not going to flesh out too well. But maybe they'll be able to do it in later episodes, but that seems sort of rubbed me a little bit the wrong way. But then we get to Manipur, where they're going after trying to find where the super soldier serum came from. This was a fascinating, really fun look. I loved the look of this sort of like pirate, sort of like under the law sort of city that they visited, the Hightown, Lowtown. It seems like there's such an interesting world building here that's going on that I just found fascinating. It's probably a thing from the comics, but I just found that just such a cool city to sort of dive into and get a look at. And again, very John Wickian in how it's represented, even down to the like people riding on their motorcycles with the masks, was just, it felt all very John Wick to me. Right to the point where we go into the bar, and it's a really wonderful scene where they all have to stay in character. And I thought that was just a lot of fun. Winter Soldier Bucky had to pretend to be the Winter Soldier again, and he just jumped right back into form. Sam sort of having me pretend to be this guy and drink the shot that he didn't, like I already kind of talked about that in my spoiler-free section. All really good stuff, really, really kind of a fun bit, but again, all staying within that interesting tone that this episode sets up. Then we get into another scene that I didn't like as much, where we go and meet Shelby. She's sort of there to give exposition and sort of tell us a little bit more about where the super soldier serum came from. And the scene was going fine for me. It was like, okay, this is just sort of an exposition scene. But then Sam gets that call with his sister. That really just felt like a narrative cheat to me, to just have like an action sequence and get them out of that scene, because I feel like Sam would have been smart enough to turn off his phone. I mean, he's a professional. He's done this before. Like, I feel like just turn off your phone and don't talk to your sister in the middle of this. It was just, I know the lady forced him to turn it on, but it was just like, I feel like he would have had his phone off in that sequence. It was just, it felt a little bit forced, and just there to kind of remind us that his sister is a character in this world, just to sort of bring her up within this episode. But ultimately, that conflict felt kind of forced. But then, Shelby gets killed by someone off in the distance. Like, oh, that's an interesting sort of take. But then they sort of get the John Wick 3 thing where they have bounties on them and they need to run before they get killed by their bounties, which was a lot of fun. Again, very John Wickian. But as they're escaping, it only lasts for a few seconds. Another kind of disappointment on my end, because it was like, that was a cool setup. Obviously, a whole movie, John Wick had done that sort of thing. But ultimately, it seems like it's fairly discarded here fairly quickly, because they beat the bad guys, and Sharon Carter comes in to save the day. So a little bit sad that was tossed away. Hopefully, it'll come back up later that they have bounties on their head, because I don't think that was necessarily dealt with. So hopefully that will come up. It does come up a little bit later on in this episode for a nice little action sequence, but I would be interested to see that play out a little bit more than just be like, oh, we need some action sequences thrown in here. Oh, also, I should mention, we got references to the power broker, this person who has all this information, wants the super soldier serum, is also after the Flagsmashers. There is an interesting question. I know some people in the comments wonder if Zemo might be the power broker, which would be an interesting sort of twist, that Zemo turns out to be this guy all along, has been manipulating events. Certainly fits him as a character, as being the master Machiavellian puppet master sort of character. So I definitely see that as definitely being the twist, but possibly not. So we'll sort of see where that goes. So that wasn't revealed in this episode, but I could definitely see that being the case, considering that he's working towards the same ends as the power broker of getting to the Flagsmashers. So interesting little piece there, and I like the sort of power broker being a character sort of in the background playing up here. So cool to see where that goes. But anyways, back to Sharon Carter. It was nice to see her back. I liked her getting a lot more character in this scene here, that she actually has a lot more personality. She seems to have a chip on her shoulder after Civil War. She very much felt like kind of like a love interest to Steve character, not much beyond that in the previous appearances that she had. So it was nice to see her develop her own personality throughout here and really feel like she was coming into her own. One thing I will say about that is it did kind of bug me, because I feel like Steve, of all people, would not have forgotten her. Like, he loved her grandmother so much. You would think he wouldn't have forgotten her during the 5 years that he was sort of sitting around doing nothing during the blip, that he was like, oh yeah, maybe I'll clear her name while I have some time after the blip, just gonna go deal with that. I just feel like he would have done that, and so it felt a little bit forced that she hadn't been sort of gotten her pardon, but it was sort of a nice way to sort of get her into this. But it was just sort of a little bit of a frustrating thing for me. Then we get a dance sequence for some reason. They're just having fun dancing. Nothing really to say there. All it was like a dance sequence while Sharon did stuff. And then we go to meet this new scientist who made the super soldier serum. It was a very creepy scene going up into meeting him. And clearly the super soldier serum guy has like the hots for the serum. He's like, I'm going to make the best serum ever. It's going to be so subtle. It's going to be so subtle and good, you guys. It's going to be the best serum ever. It's all I could think about during that whole time. Just very much the hots for the serum. But I like the sort of reference to the blip within that he only didn't create the serum earlier because the blip happened and he got turned to dust, and the power broker was interested in coming after the serum after Hydra sort of gave up on the program. Interesting sort of use of world building and building up the power broker is an interesting threat throughout this. It was also interesting that Zemo shoots him. It makes a lot of sense that Zemo would shoot the guy that was making the super soldier serum. So just sort of like wanting to cut up that loose end. It sort of fits his goals and his interest, though it would go against the theory that he is the power broker, because if the power broker wanted the serum, why would Zemo kill the guy that could possibly make the serum? So interesting sort of like possible saying, like, red herring there for Zemo being the power broker. Also, I find it kind of funny that like while they're having this long in-depth interrogation of this guy, Sharon's just out there beating up a ton of people, just kicking butt. It was just like, wow, she's kicking a lot of butt and killing a lot of people while these two are just having a nice conversation. It was just like, okay, let the girl do all the work. It was just kind of funny. And then obviously they have a battle. Zemo gets his mask on. That was a cool moment, being very, very, very bad. It's like, I'm gonna just be a badass and wear the mask. And then the bickering between Bucky and Sam was also super interesting. It sort of shows that they don't have that they still are not professional when working with each other, and that they will break down in sort of the heat of the moment. Kind of going to their relationship as characters. I'm liking that we're starting to see them connect more, but there's still this sort of frustration between the two of them. And also just Sharon being like, oh my God, just focus for 2 freaking seconds, guys. One quick other scene I forgot to mention is clearly Walker's on the heels of Bucky and Sam, and they're going to go undercover and not necessarily report to their bosses in order to go after those two and sort of be hot on their heels in terms of finding the Flagsmashers, sort of hinting and alluding to the fact that maybe Walker may go too far in his pursuit of the Flagsmashers, but ultimately he was kind of sidelined for most of this episode, so I'm curious to see where that is going to go. And then just to kind of wrap out the episode, they go off to like a base that Zemo has and a place that he knows to go. I like the little scene that he's talking about where he sort of says like, hey, you never went and visited the memorial for Sokovia. Of course you didn't. You never care about the like collateral damage. I like that sort of like subtle piece of writing there, and sort of reminding that he was from Sokovia and he lost a lot of his family there. Again, going back to his sympathy as a character, I thought was really kind of nice there. And then also we have Bucky going off and seemingly finding someone from Wakanda, and it's nice to see that Wakanda is getting roped into the action going on here. I'm curious to see how that plays out in the long run, to possibly see Wakanda sort of jumping into the geopolitical parts of this, especially considering that Zemo killed Black Panther's father way back in Civil War. So clearly they'll have some issues with the Winter Soldier working with Zemo. So curious to see where that is going to go, and an interesting cliffhanger to end us out on. So ultimately, I have to say this episode was really, really strong. It felt like, I said, a very interesting tonal shift for the MCU, but still felt like within the universe of the MCU, stylistically really, really unique for the MCU. The music was wonderful, the characterization was wonderful, the situations sort of developed interestingly. I do feel like there was a few choices here and there, like Sam's phone call scene and the making the Flagsmashers a little less nuanced, or a bit disappointing in the long run. But overall, I have to say that this was probably one of my favorite MCU things in general. I just love the sort of John Wickian style of things, and the action sequences are also filmed very wonderfully. So overall, great episode with a few niggling things here and there that I didn't love, but I'd love to hear what you thought of the episode. Did you like episode 3? I'd love to hear all your comments below. Don't forget to subscribe to this channel for more discussions of this show and even more shows and LGBTQ issues and pop culture and all that stuff. That's all on here on this channel. But beyond all of that, I hope that you, as always, live long and prosper. Patrons, it is time to assemble! Catherine Lambeth, Miranda Janelle, Ashley Allen, Bokikio, Eli Bergmoss, Ashlyn Solstice, John Cool, Greg Gillum, Stephen Kleinard, Chamomile T, Randy Thompson, Wellington Marcus, Boyd Earl, and Mary Beth Earl, Stephen Schuhart, Wayne Twitchell, Auntie Kate, 808, Rick Osborne, Dominic Noble, Ish the Mad, Buttoneer, John Steele, Meadow Whisperer, Gavin Robinson, Michael Beam, Munir Amlani, BBD, Jason Knott, Hannah F, Andrew K, Bree Beecher, Jasmine, Sky Skinner, Maeve, Skylar Gray, Flynn Nathan Steele, Tiffany Danger, Sean Piper, Geek Filter, Jane Packard, Wen Dizzle Bizzle. Why do I do this to myself? Sarah Bystem, James Karate, Jacob Tovar, W. Randy, Edie, Mari Neckar, Bush, Celestial Dawn, Din, Mark the Edge, Pissed and Twisted Garage, Lily, Polly Mina, Laura Demo, Liza, Nikki, Gordon, Bloomfield, Andrew, Lamoureux, Zone 1 Librarian, Jenny Mabel, Michael Hardy, and finally, Corey Honkanen and Vale Dunn. Alright, not my best patron rap, but I figured it would still be fun for you to see all my failure on screen, immortalized in every video this month. Also, I know I mixed Captain America and Superwoman. Deal with it. But thank you, honestly, to all my patrons. I really appreciate all of you, and you really mean a lot to me. I would not be able to do this without you. Thank you so much for supporting me being an absolute dork and weirdo. I wish you all the best.